Okay, thanks Sabine for the introduction. I think, I'll just lay out what I'm going to tell you and why. So the idea is this is going to be a bit more concrete lecture than the previous one by John, but sort of ties quite well into the themes of it. So as Sabine said, myself and my friend and colleague Mark Feldon. Mark is a geographer from Luxembourg. I'm a journalist and writer, as Sabine mentioned. Topic is interregnum, what comes after liberal democracy. And so the idea is I'm going to try and give you a bit of a political topography of the current moment, where we're at, what options are on the menu politically, globally, and where we might go from here. So no one can literally see into the future, but what we can do is we can look at current pathways, we can look at possible trajectories, we can look at what's happening right now, and we can extrapolate, and then I think we can come to quite reasonable assumptions about what the future might hold for us politically. So I'm going to share just basically quite a bit of the research Mark and I have done for this book, and we're going to follow the structure of the book in this talk. A few points about the book in general. It's sort of in the American essay style, so it's about making a point. It's quite polemical. It does not pretend to be objective. And we decided to use any example which really does exist, no matter how extreme. So one could say, one could take issue with extreme examples and say there's a student in Scotland who identifies as a fox, and all his teachers have been told to tell his classmates to respect this identity. And you could say, okay, this is like one Daily Mail article, and this is right-wing culture wars to make an issue out of this. But the fact that the example does exist, even that says something about the current moment, right? And the style is kind of literary. We've tried to sort of film our own society from a lens which is a bit of an abstraction, like as if we were writing a bit of a science fiction book about our own society, except that the examples are not fictional. So none of them are made up. They all have real sources. But the literary style is sort of to step back a few meters away from the subject matter, say as like a visitor from China or so might see the West currently. So why is this important? Liberal democracy, Francis Fukuyama declared at the end of history, famously, right? And it seems sometimes like the air we breathe, you know, common sense. And it's important, of course, to say liberalism is an ideology, as some people like the post-liberals, like Patrick Deneen, make this point. To continue on with the structure of the book, it's in 3 parts. And part 1 is what was liberalism. So note the past tense there, that we're moving away from this. We start with the history of liberalism, so we go to thinkers like Thomas Hobbes and so on. I'm going to sort of skip this a bit. And what we do as well in this part is we describe an ideal. An ideal, obviously, by definition, has never existed. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an ideal. But it can still be an ideal we strive towards, or which inspires us, right? So we describe liberal democracy at its best, like a society where students learn at school about the advantages of this system. They play out in role plays, what happens in parliament, for instance, the role of the opposition. They engage in debating competitions. And we take also some of the real moments of liberal democracy at its best, like anecdotally, for instance, during the height of the war in Algeria, President Charles de Gaulle was approached with the idea of arresting the radical Marxist writer Jean-Paul Sartre, and he said, one does not arrest a Voltaire. So even this tolerance of other opinions, the ability of liberal democracy to integrate radical views into its process. And we ask a very empirical question, which is, are we moving closer towards this ideal, or are we moving further away from it? And so what we see empirically is we see an increasing assault on free speech in the name of protecting certain groups from offense. For instance, we see rise of a radical identity politics. We see the rise of sort of technocratic, supranatural, not supranational, obviously, institutions which sort of have taken a lot of power from the elected parliaments. We say a lot of confusion, ability to define what is a citizen, or even what is a man, what is a woman. We see ever-expanding human rights, with which as well democracy is curtailed, the power of parliaments is curtailed. And so I think that answers the question, are we moving away from this or moving closer to this ideal? What is interesting is that a lot of the oldest liberal societies appear to share the same pathologies. So they all seem to bring forth these radical identity politics. They all seem to bring forth societies which have very old liberal tradition, like the UK, the United States, Canada, the Netherlands. They bring forth these discussions about gender self-ID. Liberal societies tend to have liberal immigration. They tend to have liberal laws on assisted dying, for instance. So there's these parallels across continents if you look at Australia or Canada. So what's going on? So a lot of these pathologies, let's call them, appear to have something to do with overcoming borders in the broadest sense. So men and women, or between the generations, between citizens and non-citizens. And they seem to have something to do with any imposition on the individual, be it by a national tradition, common values, common ways of behaving, appears to increasingly be seen as some kind of something intolerable. So this points to like a central dialectic in liberalism, which a lot of people in the post-liberal tradition have written about. So in the name of ever greater freedom, ever greater liberation of the individual, we see sort of this tipping into the authoritarian solutions. So these hate speech legislation, or fines of several thousand euros in Germany if you misgender someone or speak to them with the first name they were born with if they decided to change their gender. So these authoritarian solutions, which are in a way supposed to protect the individual flourishing quite independently of any kind of limit. So like a borderless or unconstrained liberalism. I think John touched on this as well in his lecture. And so one of the authors in the post-liberal tradition, Patrick Deneen, says succinctly, liberalism has failed because it has succeeded. So it seems to be dissolving these foundations which are not by themselves liberal. So Christian charity, national traditions, and so on, civic virtue. And we call this unbounded liberalism, we call it hyper-liberalism, which brings me to the second part of the book. And here we describe three instances where we think hyper-liberalism is particularly damaging, and we call them regimes. So the first one is the diversity regime, which I'm sure you've all sort of heard of. It's all these, the rise of radical identity politics, the rise of a state which administers these different identities. So you have, in the San Francisco Bay Area, you have a council which says we're building affordable housing for Native Americans, blacks, and Pacific Islanders. So the administration of diversity, separate student housing for LGBT students, anti-racism workshops, diversity commissioners, and in the corporate world, a lot of the same thing in parallel, so the diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, those kind of things. And the second regime we describe is, we call it like a green regime, which I'm sure you've also read a bit about. So we start with Sri Lanka, where Western technocrats descended upon this nation, quite poor developing nation, convinced the local elites to switch entirely to organic farming. So even there, an idea of unbounded liberalism, you can literally do anything. It's just by willpower, we take this nation, we completely transform its agriculture. The effect being the economy collapsed, skyrocketing prices of staples like rice, and eventually the government overthrown. And we ask, along with authors like Joel Kotkin, the geographer who lives in California, if ideas like net zero in Western societies could lead to similar results. So the results are already, you can already see them, as in people find it ever harder to acquire property, to achieve the American dream. So there's this, unsocial or geared towards a broad middle class. They are the ones who suffer from this. We conducted quite a few interviews. So Joel Kotkin, for instance, we have two people, I think, in the audience who've been interviewed for this book, Professor Frank Furedi and Dr. Kevin Ewell. So thanks again for that. And then we describe a third excess of hyperliberalism, which you could call a transhumanist regime or a biopolitical regime. This is all to do about the body. We have lots and lots of topics we touch on here. I've been told by readers that this is the most disturbing chapter, or that which, they found that the scariest, or which made them most emotional. So two things there. For instance, the whole hype around gender reassignment, so ever younger people taking puberty blockers, a boom in gender assigning surgeries, so quite literally taking bits off the body, putting bits on the body, removing bits of the lower arm and making a penis and sticking it on. You have to be very concrete about these things, and this is why I said extreme examples always, if it does exist, describe it quite brutally, right? So, another thing which people told me touched them about this chapter is the whole rise of assisted dying, where I thank Dr. Ewell for being available as an interview partner. Also in all these liberal societies, so Netherlands, Canada, so we have this assisted dying for people with PTSD or who couldn't find housing. Yeah. And then, and part 3, and this is I think the most interesting chapter, the most interesting part of the book. So we describe hyperliberalism and we describe what we call the antipodes of hyperliberalism. And this is quite a mixed bunch. I call it the good, the bad, and the ugly. So we have, it starts with a chapter called social conservatism. I don't necessarily mean by that socially conservative, but also in the literal sense, social conservative. Right, so this is a bit the blue labor tradition, which John talked about a bit as well. It can mean concretely in Europe, it can mean countries like Denmark, who have quite a regulated immigration, insist on integration, so send people into courses, language courses, civic and citizenship courses, even resettle people who are non-Western to a different part of town to prevent ethnic ghettos from developing. And all this combined with a classical Scandinavian welfare state. We have maybe a bit more controversially countries like Poland under the long-term rule of the Peace Party, the National Conservative Party, who combined Catholicism, patriotism, military education for young people and so on, but also with building housing, helping pensioners, generous child benefits. And our theory is societies which go in this social conservative direction, they have a lot of these pre-liberal influences which sort of temper the liberalism a bit. So you can see this as well in Italy, which is quite Catholic, has also a right populist prime minister, and just isn't so open for this hyper-liberal revolution. And then we go on to another model. This is a model which is a bit easy to make fun of, and I'll explain why. And I explain why I think it's plausible nevertheless. We call this the authoritarian city-state. So you can see in the world, there's some places which are nation-states, sovereign states, but which are run a little bit like a corporation. So we have Singapore, or Dubai. Singapore, founded by the Lee family, who sort of tend to monopolize politics, even though on paper it's a parliamentary democracy. It's dominated by one party and one family. Free trade, so ease of doing business, but also law and order policies, quite paternalistic and conservative policies. They call this Asian values, which can even include things like public canings of people who have committed graffiti, for instance. Or Dubai, which is a bit similar, run by the Al Maktoum family, also trying to attract expatriates, free trade, an important port as well, a hub for aviation. And there's people, they call themselves the Free Cities movement, who think this should be a model more generally, right? So you can say, what is a private free cities movement? Comes out of a libertarian tradition, and people might say that this is unrealistic, or what's a private free city? Is it like a bunch of libertarian young men, they buy an oil rig and they live there and reintroduce the gold standard or something? You can easily make fun of this. But it has quite prominent supporters, people like Peter Thiel, the US investor and libertarian. There's been some quite concrete projects, among others in Honduras, where the previous right-wing government set up a kind of free trade zone where a lot of the administration would be like a company. The state would pretty much withdraw and hand it a part of the country to like a private corporation. I know Patrick Schumacher, the London-based architect. I think he's here with us today. He's been involved with this project. I'll come to the state. Yeah, come to the point. And so yeah, it's not completely unrealistic. I think Peter Thiel wants to do a project like this more in the Mediterranean area. And we look at Russia as well. Also, because it quite consciously at the moment, the leadership in Russia markets itself as an alternative to hyper-liberalism. So it's about tradition, religion, but also quite unsavory. It's a lot more controversial than other examples I've given. So military expansionism, kidnapping of Ukrainian children to Russify them, irredentism, forced labor as well, those kind of things. Alliance with Iran, a hardcore anti-Semitic regime. And yeah, what we look at as well is very spontaneous uprisings, and these tend to be mainly in opposition to the green regime. So we have these things like the Yellow Vests movement in France, or these pan-European farmers' protests, which maybe you've seen. I saw them in Berlin. It's quite impressive, couple of thousands of tractors descending on a European city. So yeah, it's difficult to see what kind of structured real politics can arise from this. I know in the Netherlands there's a party which arose out of these farmers' protests, the farmer citizen movement. And then we look finally at one other model, the kind of model of inner immigration. So this is like conservative authors like Rod Dreher, who wrote the book The Benedict Option. You say, like, if this hyper-liberal or woke revolution continues, the people who disagree with it, they will have to live a bit like the dissidents in the Eastern Bloc. They keep your opinions to yourself at work, create refuges in your private life, keep alive the memory of a better time. Yeah, so as I said, no one can literally see into the future. We can make educated guesses. I think a lot is currently in transition. It's quite murky. Which brings us also, if you've heard interregnum, you've probably heard the Gramsci quote, the old is dying, but the new cannot be born. So what might happen, will hyperliberalism double down on its oppressive tendencies? Or might there, out of liberalism, emerge something like a mature liberalism? I think that's kind of the hope of some people like Jordan B. Peterson, the conservative Canadian intellectual, with his things like Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, so classically liberal ideas, but with the hope that this can sort of be tempered by other ideas of like civic virtue and so on. So yeah, I'll leave you at that. I hope I've left you with some ideas what's on the menu currently and where we might be going politically.